When I was 24 years old, I started working as a ranger at Zion National Park in Utah. And one of the things that they informed us about during training was to be wary of the weather. And that's simply because even though it didn't happen every time that it rained, flash floods were something that occurred in the park, especially in the areas with a lot of trails through the canyon's crevices. Now, even though they warned us to be wary of flash floods, for the first 4 years that I worked in the park, I had never actually seen one, and therefore, I never really understood the warnings. But when you see your first real flash flood, you'll understand why there's something that you should never joke about. I'll never forget it. We had closed one of the trails on a weekend in the middle of the summer because we were getting a lot of flood warnings, and that didn't go over well with some of the hikers that had come to visit on summer vacation. So for all of Friday and the first half of Saturday that weekend, a few of the other rangers and I kept having to go out to the trail to stop young hikers from trespassing because we kept finding out that they were using that trail. That all stopped when the rain started coming down on Saturday. Though sadly, at that time I was actually out on the trail looking for anyone that might need to be told that it was closed. Now you have to understand the trail itself was pretty wide, but it cut right through one of the smaller hills in the area and acted as a natural gutter for the rain. So all of the rainwater that was coming down the side of the mountain was essentially collecting at the top of the trail and running right through the canyon. And while you wouldn't think that it would end up having enough pressure to sweep you away, you'd be wrong. I'll never forget the moment that I realized that I had been on the trail longer than I should have. It had started raining about 30 minutes before I decided that the trail seemed clear from civilians and that I could head back to the station. And I'll never forget the intense fear that coursed through my body as I heard the sound of rushing water in the distance. I looked up the trail and could see a small layer of water rushing over the surface of the ground, and before I knew it, the water had reached me and kept flowing through the crevice. At first the water was only a little bit above my ankle and I actually started to calm down a bit. I figured that I could get out of that situation with no problem. But when the water level quickly started to rise, panic set in again. Within a matter of seconds, the water had risen above my knees and I could feel myself being pushed over. I tried to fight the force of the flood as best as I could, but by the time the water had reached my waist, it literally swept me off of my feet. I began to twist and turn as I tried to fight the water that had now turned into what seemed like rapids. And before I knew it, it was too late. There was nothing I could do to try to stop the flooding from taking me. All I could think of was to try to keep myself at the surface of the water and protect myself from hitting any rocks. Just as I had the thought though, I felt the bottom half of my body smash into a large rock structure that was underneath the brown, rapidly moving waters. The impact tossed me around as the water kept pulling me along with it, and this time I couldn't reorient myself. I had been forced under the water by the rushing of the rapids, and after spinning in circles, I couldn't quite figure out which way was up. And then bam, I smashed the back of my head on what I can only assume was the side of the mountain. Everything went black after that, and all I could think of was that I was dead. Thankfully, the trail opened up shortly after I had been knocked unconscious and the water level dropped enough for me to resurface, and I was saved by a nearby hiker that actually should not have been on that trail in the first place. After waking up in the hospital, I thanked the man for saving my life, and he explained to me that he had actually just managed to make it out the crevice before the water started to trickle by him. The only reason he was waiting there was that he didn't want to be swept away as I had been. Either way, I was very happy that he was there to pull me out of the shallow water and bring me to safety. My first year as a park ranger also happened to be my last. In fact, if I'm being honest with you, I didn't even make it a full year. But I wasn't the only person in my division that resigned that day. My partner filled out his paperwork as well, and he worked in the specific station for 4.5 years before I even started. To this day, neither of us can really explain what was out in those woods with us on the evening that we quit, but it was clear that we weren't supposed to be there. It was my first night covering the overnight shift, which was vastly different from our daytime routines for the most part. During the day shift, we all just waited in the station in case an emergency call came in, and that rarely happened. According to my boss, there was only one serious incident where campers had gone missing and they were out all night searching. Other than that, though, the night shift was pretty calm. Things changed on my fourth night on the job, though. You see, we got a call from one of the rangers that had just ended their shift, and they said that on their way down the trail to the entrance of the park, they spotted a bear in the area. And normally that wouldn't be an issue, but we had campers in the area that night, so it was me and my partner Mike's job to head up to the campsite and just give everyone notice. They didn't have to leave or anything like that because a bear in the area wasn't too uncommon. But it was our job to inform them just for their own safety. Let me tell you, walking through those thick woods at night is a totally different feeling than walking in the comfort of daylight. I could hardly see 7 feet in front of me, and that was with our flashlights on, and the sounds around me seemed to be almost amplified by the stillness of the nighttime air. Mike and I made it over to the campsite as quickly as we could. It was clear that neither of us wanted to be out there that night. And when we finally got to the campsite, we were surprised to see that it was cleared out. There was no one there, and it seemed like the campers had picked up after themselves pretty well. We were both a little irritated when there was no one at the campsite because we had walked all that way for nothing. But that anger quickly faded when we both heard the sound of something breathing very heavily. The sound was coming from our right side, but when we both pointed our flashlights, we couldn't see anything through the thick foliage. We both listened closely, and I began to strain my eyes as much as I could to try and see what we were hearing. That was when I heard Mike tell me that we needed to get back to the cabin as fast as we could. I asked him what it was, and he said that he didn't know. I didn't argue with him, and the two of us began slowly walking back toward the trail that would lead us to the ranger station. And the entire time we kept our flashlights fixed on the area where we heard the breathing come from. Almost as soon as we started moving, though, I could feel chills running through my entire body as the deep breathing noise slowly shifted to a low, guttural growl. Out of nowhere, we could have heard the sound of something running through the woods behind that tree line. And though we couldn't see it clearly, we could tell that it was very large. I remember thinking that it must be the bear that the other ranger told us about. But when? Before I could ask Mike what he thought about it, he said, "I don't think that's a bear." And in that very moment, another deep, guttural noise came from the direction that the large beast was running around in. Only this time, I would describe it more as a howl than a growl. I had never heard anything like it, and all I knew at that moment was that we needed to get out of that forest. Mike and I took off as fast as we could toward the ranger station, though we knew that it was at least a 4-minute sprint. And the entire time, we could clearly hear whatever it was following us. I'll never forget the sound of the animal's heavy footsteps as it practically ran alongside us in the woods. The entire time we were running, we figured that it was going to catch us and there would have been nothing that we could do about it. Thankfully, about 200 feet away from the cabin, Mike and I both heard whatever it was shift its course as it started running in a direction that was away from us. That night, we made it back into the cabin and tried for hours to figure out what it was that chased us. And when we couldn't figure it out, we both decided that it might be better to find a different job that wasn't anywhere near that ranger station. That being said, I had never found myself in a more terrifying situation than when I was patrolling one of the national parks where I worked. You see, it was my second week at that location and I was still trying to find my bearings and get a good feel for that area. And I asked if I would be allowed to camp out in the woods for a few days just to relax my days off and also so that I could walk around and get a better feeling for my surrounding. My boss actually loved the idea and said that it wouldn't be a problem. Even gave me a radio just in case I found something and needed to communicate while I was off the clock. My initial plan was to stay in the woods for the entire weekend and into the beginning of the week, but I ended up having to call it quits after the first night because of what happened to me. You see, It was around 10 at night and I was laying down in my tent getting ready for bed when I heard a noise out in the distance. I decided to check it out to see if it was an animal. But as I slowly crept out of my tent, I was surprised to see the light coming from flashlights in the distance. There were 3 of them, and they were heading in a direction that ran parallel to where I was camping. I figured that they were just campers as well, and although that wasn't technically allowed for civilians in that area, I figured that they probably weren't going to do any harm. So I had originally planned on leaving them alone. But just to be sure, I wanted to follow them back to their camp and check that they were in a safe environment. I tried my best to stay as quiet as possible as I followed their trail of light, but I was really surprised at how far they were walking. I must have been following them for about 20 minutes before they stopped. And what surprised me even further was that they didn't go to a campsite. Instead, it looked like they had built a small structure out of sticks and camouflaged it using leaves and branches. I mean, this thing was nearly impossible to see at night, and they led me right to it. That's how well hidden it was. Now, at that point, my plan was to simply go back to my tent and check it out in the morning. That all changed, though, as I went to turn around and saw a flashlight coming up from behind me. I had miscounted earlier, and there weren't 3 of them. There were 4. I heard the man who was walking up behind me yell out to me, "Hey, who's that?" He yelled in an agitated voice. And before I could even start running, I could hear the sound of the people in the structure shuffling around. I decided to take off as fast as I could back toward my tent. I didn't know what it was, but something was off about those guys. I'm glad I followed my gut and ran, too, because as I made my way through the dark forest, doing my best to avoid any trees, I heard the unmistakable sound of gunshots going off. I can only imagine that they were shooting in my direction, though I can't be certain. I ran the entire way back to my tent, which felt like it was at least 2 miles. And once I was there, I radioed the ranger station, and they sent a few of the guys out to get me. The next day, we all went back to the area where I had seen the structure, and although the people weren't there anymore, all of their equipment was. It looked like some sort of distillery. So we ended up calling law enforcement, who figured out it was most likely moonshiners. They said that I was lucky to make it out of the area with my life, because if they got caught, those guys could go to jail for years, and it's likely they would have killed me if they caught me.